The cruelest betrayals come wrapped in family traditions, served on your grandmother's china with a smile. I should know, because I've spent 43 years perfecting the art of swallowing humiliation with a grateful expression. But on Thanksgiving, day 2024, something inside me finally snapped, and what I discovered afterward would change everything I thought I knew about the people I'd sacrificed my entire adult life for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like every Thanksgiving for the past 15 years. I was up at 5 a.m., standing in my kitchen in Millfield, Connecticut, wearing the same burgundy apron my mother had given me decades ago. The turkey was already in the oven, a 22-pound bird that had cost me nearly $60, but would feed the 12 people coming to my house. 12 people who expected me to provide everything while contributing nothing but their appetites and opinions about how things should be done. My name is Linda Patterson, and I'm 58 years old. I've been hosting Thanksgiving dinner since my divorce was finalized, taking over the tradition when my ex-husband Tom decided his new wife Ashley was too delicate to handle large family gatherings. Ashley, who was 26 when they got married, and had never cooked anything more complicated than instant ramen, apparently needed to preserve her energy for more important things, like posting Instagram photos of their weekend trips to Napa Valley using money that should have been going toward our children's college expenses. But I didn't fight it. I never fought anything back then. I just smiled, nodded, and added another responsibility to my already overflowing plate. That's what I did. I was the reliable one, the one who made everything work, who smoothed over every family crisis and made sure everyone else was comfortable, even when it left me exhausted and overlooked. As I peeled potatoes in the pre-dawn darkness, I could hear my neighbor Mrs. Henderson's dog barking in the distance. The sound echoed across the quiet suburban street where I'd lived for 22 years, where I'd raised my 3 children in a modest colonial that I'd somehow managed to keep after the divorce. Every room in this house held memories of birthday, parties, Christmas mornings, and homework sessions at the kitchen table. I'd worked double shifts as a nurse at Hartford General Hospital to make the mortgage payments, often coming home so tired I could barely stand. But it was worth it. This house was stability for my kids when everything else in their world had fallen apart. My oldest, Rebecca, was 31 now and worked as a marketing director in Boston. She'd married Kevin, a software engineer who made good money but had the personality of wet cardboard. They had 2 children, Emma and Jack, ages 8 and 6, who I adored despite seeing them only a handful of times a year. Rebecca always had an excuse for why visits were brief or why holidays were inconvenient. Her career, Kevin's schedule, the kids' activities. There was always something more important than spending time with the grandmother who sent birthday cards with checks inside and never missed a school play or soccer game when invited. My middle child, Andrew, was 28 and lived in Manhattan where he worked as an investment banker. Andrew was charming and intelligent, the kind of son who called just often enough to make you think he cared, but never often enough to actually be present. He'd been dating the same woman, Melissa, for 3 years, but they were too busy building their careers to think about marriage or children. Too busy, apparently, for more than obligatory holiday appearances and the occasional Sunday phone call, when he needed advice about his taxes or his lease agreement. Then there was my youngest, Sarah, 25, and still figuring out her life. She'd graduated from college with a degree in art history and had been bouncing between part-time jobs and creative projects ever since. Sarah lived in a tiny apartment in Hartford, about 20 minutes away, and was the only one of my children who visited regularly. She was also the only one who ever offered to help with anything, though I usually ended up doing most of the work. Anyway, because her help came with endless chatter about her latest drama or creative endeavor. As I worked in the kitchen that morning, I felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on my shoulders. Not just the expectation to provide a perfect meal, but to be the perfect hostess, the understanding ex-wife, the grateful mother who, never complained about being taken for granted. I'd been playing this role for so long that I sometimes wondered if there was anything left of the woman I'd been before marriage, and motherhood had transformed me into someone whose primary function was serving others. The stuffing was cooling on the counter when my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca, running about 30 minutes late. Kevin had to take a work call. Don't wait for us to start cooking anything. I stared at the message, feeling the familiar spike of frustration that came with being treated like hired help rather than family. This was Rebecca's standard operating procedure. Show up late, offer no help, and expect everything to be ready and waiting. Andrew's text came 10 minutes later, bringing Melissa and her sister who's visiting from California. Hope that's okay. 3 extra people with less than 4 hours' notice. I added another place setting to my mental list and wondered if I had enough food. There was always enough food because I always prepared for exactly these kinds of last-minute additions. But that wasn't the point. The point was that my children treated my home like a restaurant where they could change their reservations without consideration for the person doing all the work. Sarah arrived first, as she always did, carrying a bottle of cheap wine and wearing a vintage dress she'd found at a thrift store. She looked beautiful in the way young women always do, with that effortless grace that comes from not yet understanding how the world will gradually wear you down. She kissed my cheek and surveyed the kitchen with wide eyes. "Mom, this looks incredible, as always. You're amazing. How do you do all this?" Sarah's praise felt genuine, but it also highlighted something that bothered me more each year. My children were amazed by what I accomplished, but none of them ever thought to share the load. They marveled at my abilities while simultaneously taking advantage of them. "I've had a lot of practice," I said, stirring the gravy and checking the turkey's temperature. "Could you set the table? The good china is already out on the dining room sideboard." "Of course." Sarah moved toward the dining room, then paused. "Mom, I should probably mention that I invited Jake to come later." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jake was her latest boyfriend, a struggling musician who worked part-time at a coffee shop and had strong opinions about everything despite having accomplished very little. Just for dessert, though. He has to work until 3. Another last-minute addition. I nodded without saying anything, adding one more person to the mental count. At this point, I was cooking for 15 people instead of the original 12, but expressing frustration would only make me look petty and unwelcoming. That was the trap I'd built for myself over the years. Be accommodating or be seen as difficult. There was no middle ground in my family's expectations. Rebecca and Kevin arrived with their children just as I was pulling the turkey out of the oven. Emma and Jack rushed into the kitchen, full of energy and excitement about the holiday. They hugged me enthusiastically, their small arms wrapping around my waist as they chattered about school and friends and the new video game Kevin had bought them. These moments with my grandchildren were the bright spots in family gatherings, reminders of why I endured the rest of it. Rebecca followed them into the kitchen, looking polished and professional even in casual clothes. She had inherited my height and her father's dark hair, but there was something cold in her demeanor that I couldn't remember from her childhood. Success had hardened her in ways that made me sad, though I'd never say so out loud. "Everything smells wonderful, Mom." She surveyed the kitchen with an expression that was more appraising than appreciative. Very traditional. Kevin prefers a more modern approach to holiday meals, but this is nice too. The casual dismissal stung, but I kept my smile in place. "I'm glad you approve. Could you help me carry things to the dining room? The turkey needs to rest for a few minutes before carving." "Actually," Rebecca said, checking her phone, "I need to take this call. Work emergency. Could Sarah handle it?" She was already walking toward the living room before I could respond. Her phone pressed to her ear as she launched into a conversation about quarterly projections and market analysis. Andrew arrived shortly after with Melissa and her sister. Claire, who turned out to be a loud, opinionated woman who immediately began critiquing my house's decor while simultaneously taking photos for her social media accounts. She posed in front of my fireplace, my dining room table, even my kitchen island, narrating each shot for her Instagram story about experiencing an authentic New England Thanksgiving. "This is so quaint," she announced, running her finger along my grandmother's antique sideboard. "Very farmhouse chic. You could totally monetize this aesthetic if you had the right platform." I murmured something polite while mentally calculating how many people were now coming for dinner. 16, including Jake, who would arrive later. 16 people in a dining room that comfortably seated 12. I'd need to set up the card table in the living room for the overflow, which meant more work and more coordination. Tom arrived precisely at 2 o'clock with Ashley and her parents, who'd driven up from Florida for the holiday. Ashley was 38 now, 12 years younger than me, and had aged well thanks to regular yoga classes and expensive skincare treatments that I couldn't afford on a nurse's salary. She swept into my house wearing designer clothes and carrying a store-bought pie that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. "Linda, darling, you look tired. Are you taking care of yourself?" Ashley's concern felt performative, delivered with the same tone she might use to express sympathy for a distant acquaintance's minor misfortune. "You work so hard. We really should think about catering next year. Take some of the pressure off you." The suggestion was presented as kindness, but I heard the underlying message. My efforts weren't good enough. My homemade dishes and carefully planned menu were somehow inadequate compared to what professionals might provide. Ashley had been making similar comments for years, small undermining remarks disguised as helpful suggestions. I appreciate the thought, but I enjoy cooking for the family. This was only partially true. I enjoyed the idea of cooking for people who appreciated the effort, but that described very few of the people currently crowding into my house. Ashley's parents, Bob and Eleanor, were polite but distant. They'd never quite figured out how to navigate the dynamics of their daughter's marriage to a man with 3 grown children and an ex-wife who remained stubbornly present in their lives. They treated me with the careful courtesy reserved for necessary inconveniences, people you had to tolerate but didn't need to engage with meaningfully. The next hour passed in a blur of final preparations, last-minute requests, and the chaos that always accompanied large family gatherings. I carved the turkey while Sarah mashed the potatoes. Rebecca emerged from her phone call long enough to open wine bottles, complaining about how work never really stopped, even on holidays. Andrew entertained his niece and nephew with card tricks, while Melissa and Claire documented everything for their respective social media accounts. By 3:30, we were finally ready to sit down to eat. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china and crystal glasses that had been wedding gifts 30 years ago. The food looked beautiful, if I said so myself. Golden turkey with crispy skin, mashed potatoes whipped to perfection, stuffing with just the right blend of herbs and sausage, green bean casserole topped with crispy onions, cranberry sauce that I'd made from scratch, and dinner rolls that were still warm from the oven. I'd arranged the seating carefully, putting the children at the card table where they'd be comfortable and happy, positioning the adults to minimize potential conflicts. Ashley's parents sat near Tom, Rebecca, and Kevin were across from Andrew, and Melissa, and I'd saved the chair closest to the kitchen for myself so I could easily get up to fetch anything we'd forgotten. Before we started eating, Tom cleared his throat and stood up, wine glass in hand. This was his annual tradition, the speech about gratitude and family that he'd been giving since our children were small. The irony that he was now delivering it in his ex-wife's house to celebrate with his second wife wasn't lost on me, but I'd learned to find humor in life's absurdities rather than bitterness. I want to thank Linda for once again opening her home and preparing this incredible meal. Tom's voice carried the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to giving presentations. We're grateful for her generosity and for the tradition she's maintained that keeps our family together. The words should have felt like recognition, but instead, they felt like a job performance review. Adequate work, keep it up. Everyone raised their glasses and murmured agreement before diving into their food with the enthusiasm of people who hadn't contributed to its preparation. The meal progressed with the usual family dinner conversation. Rebecca talked about work projects and Kevin's recent promotion. Andrew shared stories about his latest business trip and the restaurants he'd discovered in Chicago. Ashley's parents described their new retirement community in Sarasota, complete with golf course access and weekly social events. The conversation flowed around me while I got up repeatedly to refill serving dishes, clear empty plates, and fetch items people had forgotten they wanted. Emma and Jack chattered happily at their card table, occasionally asking me questions about the food or requesting more of their favorite dishes. They were the only people who consistently thanked me for things, their natural politeness not yet corrupted by adult entitlement. When Emma asked for a second helping of stuffing, she added please and thank you without being prompted. When Jack spilled his apple juice, he immediately apologized and asked for help cleaning it up. It was during dessert that I first noticed something odd. I'd prepared 3 different desserts: apple pie made from scratch, pumpkin cheesecake, and chocolate pecan tart. As I was cutting slices and arranging them on plates, I overheard Rebecca talking quietly to Kevin about portion sizes. Make sure Mom gets a smaller piece of the pecan tart. She's been watching her weight, and chocolate isn't good for someone her age anyway. The comment struck me as strange because I hadn't been watching my weight, and at 58, I was hardly at an age where chocolate posed any particular health risk. But I didn't say anything. I simply cut myself a smaller slice and continued serving everyone else. After dinner, the traditional post-meal cleanup began, though traditional might not be the right word since it typically involved me doing most of the work, while others helped sporadically or offered commentary from the sidelines. Rebecca loaded the dishwasher with the efficiency of someone eager to complete an unpleasant task. Andrew carried serving dishes to the kitchen with theatrical sighs about how full he was. Sarah scraped plates and packed leftovers with genuine enthusiasm, though she kept getting distracted by her phone. Ashley supervised from the doorway, offering suggestions about more efficient cleaning methods she'd learned from lifestyle blogs. You know, Linda, if you use disposable plates for the children, cleanup would be so much easier. And those microfiber cloths are much better than paper towels for wiping surfaces. I continued washing crystal glasses by hand, the same way I'd been doing it for decades, while listening to advice from someone who'd never hosted a dinner party larger than 6 people. Ashley meant well, probably, but her suggestions always carried an undertone of criticism, as if my methods were quaint relics that needed updating. The afternoon wound down with coffee and more conversation, though most people were checking their phones or making comments about traffic and early workdays. By 5 o'clock, guests were beginning to gather their coats and containers of leftovers. This was another tradition. Everyone left with enough food for several more meals, which meant I'd spend the next week eating turkey sandwiches while my house guests enjoyed variety. Rebecca hugged me goodbye with the distracted affection of someone already mentally planning her evening. Thanks for everything, Mom. Dinner was lovely. She didn't mention the next time we'd see each other or suggest making plans. That wasn't how our relationship worked. I was expected to be available when needed, but not to expect regular contact or consideration. Andrew's goodbye was warmer but equally brief. Great meal, Mom. Really outdid yourself this year. He handed me a bottle of expensive wine that he'd brought as a host gift. Though he'd drunk most of a different bottle during dinner, the gesture felt transactional rather than thoughtful, but I appreciated it nonetheless. Sarah lingered the longest, helping me finish the kitchen cleanup and chattering about her plans for the weekend. She was thinking about taking a pottery class and wondered if I'd be interested in joining her. The invitation was sweet, though I knew from experience that Sarah's enthusiasms tended to be short-lived. Still, I appreciated that she thought of me as someone who might enjoy new experiences rather than just someone who provided services. Jake never showed up for dessert, which wasn't surprising given his track record of reliability. Sarah shrugged off his absence with the casual acceptance of someone accustomed to disappointment. He probably got caught up at work. You know how it is. I didn't know how it was, actually. In my generation, when you committed to being somewhere, you showed up unless there was a genuine emergency. But I'd learned not to comment on the casual approach to commitments that seemed to characterize Sarah's generation. It only made me sound old and judgmental. By 6:30, everyone was gone except for the lingering sense of turkey and pie, the stack of dirty dishes that hadn't fit in the dishwasher, and the familiar emptiness that always followed family gatherings. The house felt too quiet after hours of conversation and laughter, but also peaceful in a way that I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat at my kitchen table, looking at the remnants of the meal. I'd spent 2 days preparing. There were still dishes to finish, floors to sweep, and furniture to rearrange. But for the moment, I just sat in the quiet and tried to process the day. Something had felt different about this Thanksgiving, though I couldn't quite identify what. The conversations had been typical, the dynamics familiar, the level of help and appreciation about what I'd expected. But there had been undercurrents I couldn't name, small moments that felt slightly off in ways I couldn't articulate. Rebecca's comment about my weight during dessert kept bothering me. It wasn't like her to be concerned about my eating habits, and her tone had been more directive than caring. Andrew had been more distracted than usual, checking his phone frequently, even during conversation. Sarah had seemed nervous about something, though she'd attributed it to excitement about Jake coming later. As I sat in my kitchen replaying the day's events, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Emma, my 8-year-old granddaughter, sent from Rebecca's phone. "Thank you for the delicious dinner, Grandma. I love you." The message made me smile for the first time since my guests had left. Children still remembered to say thank you, still expressed love freely and without reservation. Maybe that was what felt different about this year's gathering. The adults had been going through the motions, while only the children had been genuinely present and appreciative. I finished my wine and began the final cleanup, washing the remaining dishes by hand and putting away serving pieces that only came out for special occasions. Tomorrow I'd return to my regular routine at the hospital, caring for patients who needed me and appreciated my skills. Work was where I felt most competent and valued, where my efforts had clear purpose and visible results. The kitchen was finally clean by 8 o'clock, and I was settling in with a cup of tea and a slice of leftover pie when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Rebecca's name, and I felt a familiar flutter of concern. Late evening calls usually meant some kind of problem or crisis. "Mom, I'm glad you're still up." Rebecca's voice sounded strained, though I couldn't tell if she was tired or upset about something. "I wanted to thank you again for today. Everything was perfect, as always." "You're welcome, sweetheart. Is everything okay? You sound stressed." There was a pause before she answered. "Actually, there's something I need to tell you. Something we probably should have mentioned earlier, but the timing never seemed right." My stomach tightened with the kind of dread that comes from years of experience with difficult conversations. "What is it?" "Kevin got a promotion at work, a big one. We're moving to Seattle in January." The news hit me like a physical blow, though I tried to keep my voice steady. "Seattle? That's wonderful for Kevin. It's a great opportunity, and the company is covering all moving expenses." Rebecca's words came out in a rush, as if she could soften the impact by delivering the information quickly. "We've been planning it for months, but we wanted to make sure everything was finalized before we told anyone." Months. They'd been planning this for months and hadn't mentioned it until after I'd spent 2 days cooking for them, after I'd listened to Rebecca complain about work stress, without realizing she was preparing to leave her job, after I'd made plans in my head for more frequent visits with my grandchildren. "When do you leave?" I managed to ask. "Mid-January. We've already found a house and enrolled the kids in school. Kevin starts his new position February 1st, so this was goodbye. Not just for the evening, but potentially for years." Seattle was 3,000 miles away, not a weekend drive or a quick flight. Emma and Jack would grow up without their grandmother nearby. I'd miss school plays and soccer games, birthday parties, and ordinary Tuesday afternoons when they might have dropped by just to say hello. "I'm happy for you," I said, and part of me meant it. Rebecca was ambitious and capable, and following Kevin's career was probably the smart financial decision for their family. "But I'm going to miss you all terribly. We'll visit, Mom. And you can come see us once we're settled. Seattle's supposed to be beautiful." The promises felt hollow even as she made them. Cross-country visits were expensive and required significant planning. They'd become annual events at best, more likely biennial obligations that would gradually decrease in frequency as the children got older and developed their own activities and interests. After we hung up, I sat in my living room staring at family photos scattered across the mantelpiece. Rebecca's wedding picture, Andrew's college graduation, Sarah's art school portfolio presentation. Moments when I'd been proud and involved, when my presence had mattered to my children's important milestones. Now Rebecca was moving across the country and had waited until after Thanksgiving to tell me. The timing felt deliberate, as if she'd wanted to get through the holiday before dealing with my reaction to their plans. I was an afterthought in their decision-making process, someone to be informed rather than consulted. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Andrew. "Great seeing you today, Mom. Quick question, are you planning to downsize soon? Melissa and I were talking about real estate trends, and your neighborhood's gotten pretty valuable. Might be smart to sell while the market's hot." 2 pieces of news in one evening. Rebecca was moving to Seattle, and Andrew was already calculating the value of my house. The children I'd sacrificed everything for were ready to liquidate my assets and move on with their lives, leaving me to figure out what came next. I turned off my phone without responding to Andrew's text and went upstairs to my bedroom, the same room I'd shared with Tom for 15 years before he decided our marriage had run its course. The house felt larger and emptier than usual, filled with the echoes of children who'd grown up and moved away, who remembered me primarily as someone who provided services rather than someone whose feelings and future mattered. But as I got ready for bed, I found myself thinking about something Rebecca had said during our phone call. We wanted to make sure everything was finalized before we told anyone. The phrasing struck me as odd because it suggested secrecy rather than simple planning. Why wouldn't they have mentioned considering a move? Why keep it completely hidden until after the decision was made? I lay in bed that night replaying conversations from the day, looking for clues I might have missed. Rebecca's distraction during dinner, Andrew's frequent phone checking, Sarah's nervousness that I'd attributed to excitement about Jake. Had they all known about Rebecca's move? Had I been the only person at my own Thanksgiving dinner who didn't know that this might be the last time we'd all be together? The thought was too painful to pursue, but it lodged in my mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore. Tomorrow, I'd go back to work and focus on patients who needed me. But tonight, I lay awake wondering when I'd become so peripheral to my own family that major life decisions could be made without my input or early involvement. Outside my bedroom window, the November wind rattled the bare branches of the oak tree I'd planted when Rebecca was born. 31 years of growth, of weathering storms and seasonal changes, of providing shade and shelter for countless creatures. Trees at least knew their value and stood firm in their purpose. Maybe it was time I learned to do the same. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzling, matching the mood that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. I'd barely slept, my mind churning through Rebecca's phone call and Andrew's text about selling the house. The combination felt too convenient, too coordinated to be coincidental. As I got ready for work, I found myself scrutinizing every interaction from yesterday, searching for signs I'd missed. The drive to Hartford General Hospital usually helped clear my head, but today the familiar route felt mechanical, automatic. I'd been making this commute for 18 years, through morning sickness during my 3rd pregnancy, through the emotional wreckage of my divorce, through countless family crises that required me to compartmentalize my personal pain and focus on caring for others. Today was no different, except for the nagging sense that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of my family dynamics. My supervisor, Patricia Williams, noticed my distraction immediately. "Linda, you look like you haven't slept in a week. Rough Thanksgiving?" Patricia was 62, divorced, and had raised 2 sons who lived on opposite coasts. She understood the peculiar exhaustion that came from hosting family gatherings where you did all the work and received minimal appreciation, just the usual chaos. I checked the patient roster for my shift, noting 3 post-surgical cases and 2 elderly patients recovering from pneumonia. The familiar routine of medical care would provide blessed distraction from my swirling thoughts about Rebecca's secretive move and Andrew's casual suggestion about selling my house. Throughout the morning, as I checked vital signs and administered medications, I found myself thinking about family loyalty and expectations. Mrs. Rodriguez, in room 314, had 7 children, and at least 3 visited her every day, bringing homemade meals and staying for hours just to keep her company. Mr. Thompson, in 318, had 2 daughters who took turns spending nights at the hospital, refusing to let their father face his recovery alone. These families demonstrated the kind of love and commitment I'd always assumed existed in my own relationships, but yesterday's revelations were making me question everything. During my lunch break, I sat in the hospital cafeteria picking at a salad while checking my phone. There were no messages from any of my children, which wasn't unusual but felt pointed after yesterday's conversation with Rebecca. I scrolled through social media and found posts from Thanksgiving gatherings where families looked genuinely happy to be together, where adult children thanked their parents publicly for their efforts, where gratitude seemed authentic rather than obligatory. Sarah had posted a series of photos from our dinner, all carefully curated to show the beautiful table setting and delicious-looking food. The caption read, "Another amazing Thanksgiving at Mom's house. She's the best cook and hostess ever." The post had received dozens of likes and comments about how lucky she was to have such a wonderful mother. But reading it felt hollow, like praise for a performance rather than appreciation for a person. Rebecca had posted a single photo of Emma and Jack at their card table, smiling with chocolate on their faces from dessert. The caption mentioned grateful hearts and family traditions, but there was no acknowledgement of who had created those traditions or maintained them year after year. Even her gratitude felt generic, like something copied from a holiday greeting card. Andrew hadn't posted anything about Thanksgiving, which was typical for him. His social media presence focused on professional achievements and expensive restaurants rather than family moments, but his text about my house's market value kept gnawing at me. The timing felt calculated, as if he'd been waiting for the right moment to plant the seed about selling. That afternoon, while helping an elderly patient with physical therapy exercises, I found myself confiding more than I usually did. "My children keep surprising me lately, not always in good ways." Mrs. Chen, who was recovering from hip replacement surgery, looked at me with knowing eyes. "How old are your children, dear?" 31, 28, and 25. She nodded, thoughtfully. That's a difficult age for parent relationships. Old enough to think they know everything, young enough to still need help, but too proud to admit it. They take and take, then act like you're being unreasonable when you expect basic consideration. Her words resonated with uncomfortable accuracy. My children had been taking my support for granted for so long that it had become the baseline expectation, rather than something worthy of appreciation. I provided services they needed while receiving minimal emotional investment in return. After work, I stopped at the grocery store to pick up ingredients for the turkey soup I always made with Thanksgiving. Leftovers? It was another tradition I'd maintained, though I was beginning to wonder why. Rebecca would be too busy packing for Seattle to want homemade soup. Andrew lived off restaurant food and rarely cooked anything himself. Sarah would appreciate it, but one person hardly justified the effort. As I pushed my cart through the produce section, I encountered Jennifer Walsh, whose daughter had been in Sarah's graduating class. Jennifer was selecting vegetables with the focused intensity of someone planning an elaborate meal, and when she saw me, her face lit up with genuine warmth. "Linda, how was your Thanksgiving?" Jennifer's enthusiasm felt refreshing after yesterday's tepid appreciation. Mine was chaos, but good chaos. All 4 kids came home, plus grandchildren and various boyfriends and girlfriends. Complete madness. But I loved every minute of it. It sounds wonderful. I managed to smile despite the pang of envy her description triggered. My gathering had been perfectly organized and executed, but it lacked the joyful chaos she described. "You know," Jennifer continued, loading carrots into her cart, "my oldest daughter brought the most beautiful centerpiece she'd made herself, and my son surprised me by cooking the entire appetizer course. They've finally reached the age where they want to contribute instead of just consume. It's the best feeling in the world." I murmured something appropriately positive while internally contrasting her experience with my own. Jennifer's children had evolved into partners in family traditions, while mine seemed frozen in patterns of taking without giving. The difference wasn't about age or maturity, but about fundamental attitudes toward family responsibility and reciprocity. At home that evening, I spread the leftover turkey across my kitchen counter and began the familiar process of making soup. Picking meat from bones, dicing vegetables, measuring seasonings. The routine usually felt meditative, but tonight it felt mechanical, like I was going through motions I no longer understood the purpose of. My phone rang while I was sautéing onions. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I answered with cautious optimism. Maybe she was calling to offer help with something, or just to chat about her day. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I hope you won't be upset." Sarah's voice carried a nervous edge that immediately put me on alert. "Rebecca mentioned that she told you about the Seattle move last night." "Yes, she did." I stirred the onions while waiting for Sarah to continue, though I already sensed this conversation wouldn't be pleasant. "The thing is, we've all been talking, and we think it might be a good time for you to consider some changes too. You've been working so hard for so many years, and that house is really big for just one person." There it was. The coordination I'd suspected. Andrew's text about market values, Rebecca's delayed announcement about moving, and now Sarah's gentle pressure about downsizing. They'd orchestrated this campaign to convince me to sell my house, the home where I'd raised them, where every room held memories of their childhood. "What kind of changes?" I asked, though I already knew where this was heading. "Well, maybe something smaller and easier to maintain. A condo or one of those nice senior communities. You'd have less responsibility, more time for yourself, and the money from selling could help with retirement planning." Senior communities. At 58, my children were ready to ship me off to an environment designed for people in their 70s and 80s. The euphemisms about having more time for myself barely concealed their real motivation. They wanted me out of the family home so they could access whatever equity I'd built up over decades of mortgage payments. "I see. Have you discussed this with Rebecca and Andrew?" Sarah hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicions. "We're all concerned about you, Mom. Living alone in that big house, working such demanding shifts at the hospital. We just want what's best for you." How thoughtful. The sarcasm in my voice was probably lost on Sarah, who had never been particularly attuned to subtle emotional cues. And what exactly would be best for me? "Independence," Sarah said quickly. "Freedom, from home maintenance and yard work. Maybe you could travel more, take up hobbies you've never had time for." The suggestions sounded reasonable on the surface, but they ignored fundamental realities about my life and preferences. I liked my house. I enjoyed gardening and had spent years cultivating flower beds and vegetable gardens. I wasn't ready for the kind of institutional living that senior communities represented, no matter how attractively packaged. "I'll think about it," I said, ending the conversation before Sarah could present more arguments for why I should abandon the life I'd built. After hanging up, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by the familiar sights and sounds of home. The refrigerator hummed quietly, the same one I'd bought 12 years ago when the previous model finally died. The clock above the stove ticked steadily, marking time in a room where I'd prepared thousands of meals, helped with countless homework assignments, and comforted my children through various crises. This wasn't just a house. It was the repository of my adult life, the place where I'd transformed from a young wife and mother into an independent woman who'd survived divorce and raised 3 children largely on her own. The suggestion that I should abandon it for the convenience of my adult children felt like erasure of everything I'd accomplished. I finished making the soup while processing the full scope of what appeared to be a coordinated campaign to restructure my life according to my children's preferences. Rebecca's move to Seattle removed her from any obligation to provide local support. Andrew's interest in my property values suggested he saw my home as a financial asset rather than my sanctuary. Sarah's call about senior communities revealed they'd been discussing my future without including me in the conversation. The pattern was becoming clear. My children viewed me as someone whose primary function was providing services and resources. When I became inconvenient or when they needed money, they found ways to reposition my circumstances to serve their needs. The loving family relationships I'd thought we shared were actually transactional arrangements where I gave and they took. Saturday morning brought gray skies and the kind of penetrating cold that promised winter's early arrival. I'd slept poorly, again, waking repeatedly to replay yesterday's phone call with Sarah and wonder what other family decisions had been made without my input. The coffee tasted bitter, though that might have been my mood rather than the beans. I was folding laundry when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Tom standing on my front porch, looking uncomfortable and slightly sheepish. This was unprecedented. In the 15 years since our divorce, Tom had never visited my house unless he was picking up or dropping off children for some custody arrangement. "Linda, thanks for opening the door." Tom's voice carried an odd mixture of authority and supplication. "Can we talk for a few minutes?" "What about?" I didn't invite him inside, sensing that whatever he wanted to discuss would be easier to end if we stayed on the porch. "The kids are worried about you." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation he'd been delegated to have. "They think you might be going through some kind of crisis, making decisions that aren't in your best interest." "What decisions would those be?" I crossed my arms and waited for him to explain what my children had told him about my supposed crisis. "They mentioned you seemed upset about Rebecca's move and that you're being resistant to practical suggestions about downsizing." Tom's words carried the patronizing tone I remembered from our marriage, the voice he used when he thought he understood situations better than I did. "I'm not upset about Rebecca's move. I'm hurt that she kept it secret for months and announced it only after I'd spent 2 days cooking Thanksgiving dinner for them." "There's a difference." Tom frowned as if this distinction was unnecessarily complicated. "But you understand why they'd want to wait until everything was finalized before making announcements. It's just practical planning." The casual dismissal of my feelings was so typical of Tom that I almost laughed. He'd never understood emotional nuance during our marriage, and apparently divorce hadn't improved his sensitivity. He saw my hurt as unreasonable rather than natural, my desire for inclusion as neediness rather than normal family consideration. "What about Andrew's suggestion that I sell my house?" I asked. "Was that practical planning too?" Tom's expression shifted slightly, suggesting he knew more about this than he'd initially let on. "Your children are concerned about you managing a large property alone. They want to make sure you're not overwhelmed by responsibilities that might become difficult as you get older." "I'm 58, Tom, not 88. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own home and making my own decisions about my future." "Of course you are. His tone suggested he was humoring me rather than agreeing with me. But it wouldn't hurt to consider your options. Ashley and I have been looking at some beautiful retirement communities in North Carolina. Much lower cost of living, great weather, wonderful amenities. Now Ashley was involved in planning my future. The woman who'd destroyed my marriage was now offering advice about where I should spend my golden years. The audacity was breathtaking, but also clarifying. This wasn't about my well-being or practical considerations. This was about removing me from their lives in a way that felt benevolent rather than cruel. Thank you for the suggestion, but I'm quite happy where I am. I stepped back toward my door, signaling that the conversation was over. Linda, wait. Tom's voice took on a pleading quality that I hadn't heard in years. Look, I know things have been complicated between us, but we both want what's best for our children. They're adults now with their own lives and responsibilities. Maybe it's time for both of us to step back and let them build their futures without feeling obligated to manage our needs. There it was, the real message beneath all the concern about my well-being. My children felt burdened by my continued presence in their lives, by the expectation that they should consider my feelings or include me in their decisions. Tom was delivering the family's verdict that I should gracefully withdraw from active participation in their lives. I see. So this conversation is really about your children feeling obligated to maintain relationships with their mother. How terrible for them. Tom had the decency to look embarrassed. That's not what I meant, but it was exactly what he meant, and we both knew it. My children had sent their father to convince me to relocate somewhere far enough away that I wouldn't be a constant reminder of their obligations to include me in family decisions or consider my feelings when making major life changes. Have a good day, Tom. I went inside and locked the door, leaving him standing on the porch with whatever additional arguments he'd prepared. The confrontation with Tom crystallized something that had been building since Thursday's dinner. My family had decided I was inconvenient. Rebecca's move to Seattle, Andrew's interest in my property values, Sarah's pressure about senior communities, and now Tom's visit about stepping back from my children's lives. It was a comprehensive campaign to minimize my role in their futures while making the process seem like it was for my own benefit. I spent the rest of Saturday cleaning house with the kind of aggressive energy that comes from anger and hurt. I scrubbed floors, organized closets, and polished furniture until everything gleamed. Physical activity helped channel my emotions, but it didn't resolve the fundamental question of what to do with the knowledge that my children viewed me as a burden they wanted to manage rather than a person they valued. Sunday morning brought no relief from the gray weather or my darker thoughts. I attended church at St. Matthew's, where I'd been a member for over 20 years, seeking comfort in familiar rituals and community. The service focused on gratitude and family blessings, themes that felt mocking given my recent experiences. After church, I encountered several friends who asked about my Thanksgiving and seemed genuinely interested in my responses. Mary Henderson, whose husband had died 2 years earlier, described the beautiful dinner her daughter had prepared for the family. Janet Morrison talked about how her son had driven down from Vermont with his family just to spend the weekend with her. Their stories highlighted the stark contrast between their children's behavior and my own family's patterns. During the coffee hour in the church basement, I found myself sitting with Dorothy Chen, a retired teacher whose wisdom I'd always respected. Dorothy had raised 4 children who all lived within an hour's drive and gathered regularly for family dinners that rotated between their homes. "You look troubled, dear." Dorothy's observation was gentle but direct. Family gatherings can be wonderful, but they can also illuminate problems we'd rather not see. Her insight was so accurate that I found myself sharing more than I'd intended. I told her about Rebecca's secret move, Andrew's suggestions about my house, and Sarah's call about senior communities. Dorothy listened without judgment, occasionally nodding with the understanding of someone who'd navigated similar family dynamics. "It sounds like your children are trying to manage your life rather than include you in it." Dorothy's assessment was blunt but fair. "The question is whether you're going to allow them to succeed." What do you mean? I mean, you have choices here. You can accept their version of what's best for you, or you can insist on being treated as an adult who's capable of making her own decisions. Dorothy stirred sugar into her coffee while choosing her words carefully. Sometimes children need to learn that their parents aren't just resources to be managed, but people deserving of respect and consideration. Her words resonated with something I'd been feeling but hadn't articulated. My children had stopped seeing me as a full person with my own needs, desires, and autonomy. I'd become a problem to be solved, a responsibility to be minimized, a resource to be accessed when convenient. How do you teach adults to treat you differently when the patterns have been established for years? Dorothy smiled with the kind of knowing expression that comes from experience. Sometimes you have to be willing to disrupt the patterns, even when it's uncomfortable for everyone involved. Change rarely happens without some degree of conflict. That afternoon, I sat in my living room reviewing financial documents I hadn't examined in years. Bank statements, investment accounts, insurance policies, and property assessments. The picture that emerged was more encouraging than I'd expected. Despite supporting my children through college and helping with various financial emergencies over the years, I'd managed to build substantial savings and equity. My house was worth significantly more than I'd realized, a fact that explained Andrew's sudden interest in market trends. The neighborhood had gentrified considerably in recent years, with young professionals moving in and renovating properties that had been starter homes when I'd bought mine. My mortgage had only 3 years remaining, and my hospital pension would provide comfortable retirement income. I wasn't the financially vulnerable widow my children seemed to think I was. I had options, resources, and the freedom to make choices based on my own preferences rather than their convenience. This realization felt empowering in a way I hadn't experienced in years. Monday morning brought a return to work routines that felt increasingly like sanctuary. The hospital environment was demanding but fair. Patients appreciated good care, colleagues respected competence, and success was measured by concrete outcomes rather than emotional manipulation. I could control the quality of my work in ways I couldn't control my family relationships. During my lunch break, I called a real estate agent I'd met through church. Janet Sullivan was about my age, divorced, and had built a successful career, helping people navigate major life transitions. I wasn't ready to sell my house, but I wanted to understand my options and the current market conditions. Janet arrived at my house that evening with a portfolio of recent sales and a professional assessment of my property's value. Her estimates confirmed what I'd suspected from Andrew's interest. My home was worth nearly double what I'd paid for. It, representing decades of mortgage payments and property improvements. You have a beautiful home in an excellent location. Janet walked through each room with an appraiser's eye, noting updates I'd made and original features that added value. If you decided to sell, you'd have numerous options for your next step. Smaller homes in this area, condominiums, or relocating to somewhere with a lower cost of living. What about senior communities? I asked, testing whether a professional would make the same assumptions my children had. Janet looked surprised. You're nowhere near the age when most people consider that option. Those communities are designed for people who need assistance with daily living or want extensive social programming. You're still working full-time and clearly managing fine, on your own. Her assessment contradicted everything my children had suggested about appropriate housing for someone my age. I wasn't ready for institutional living, and I didn't need to downsize for practical reasons. My children's pressure to relocate had nothing to do with my actual needs and everything to do with their desire to simplify their own lives. Tuesday. Evening brought an unexpected visitor. Rebecca stood on my porch with Emma and Jack, both children bundling against the November cold. The sight of my grandchildren immediately softened my anger, though I remained wary about Rebecca's motivations for this surprise visit. Mom, we were in the area visiting Kevin's cousin, and the kids wanted to see you. Rebecca's explanation felt rehearsed, though Emma and Jack's enthusiasm seemed genuine. They hugged me with the uncomplicated affection of children who hadn't yet learned to attach conditions to their love. "Can we come in for a few minutes?" Rebecca asked. "I know you're probably tired from work, but we won't stay long." I led them into the living room where Emma and Jack immediately began exploring, examining family photos and asking questions about decorative objects they'd seen dozens of times before. Children's curiosity was refreshing after days of adult conversations loaded with hidden agendas. Rebecca settled onto the sofa with the careful posture of someone preparing for a difficult conversation. "I wanted to talk to you about our phone call Friday night. I'm worried we didn't communicate clearly about some things." "What things specifically?" I sat across from her, maintaining physical and emotional distance while the children played nearby. The suggestions about downsizing weren't meant as pressure. "We're genuinely concerned about you managing everything alone, especially with the house getting older and winter coming." Rebecca's voice carried practiced sincerity, but her words felt like talking points she'd rehearsed. "I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing fine. The house is in good condition, and I enjoy taking care of it." "I know you think you're managing fine, but sometimes it's hard to see our own limitations." Rebecca's tone shifted slightly, becoming more authoritative. "You're working demanding shifts, maintaining a large property, and dealing with all the responsibilities that come with home ownership. It might be time to consider reducing some of those stresses." The conversation felt familiar in uncomfortable ways. Rebecca was using the same patronizing approach Tom had employed during our marriage, assuming she understood my situation better than I did, and dismissing my stated preferences as unrealistic or uninformed. "Grandma, can we see our pictures in your photo albums?" Emma's request provided welcome interruption to the mounting tension between Rebecca and me. "Of course, sweetheart." I retrieved several albums from the bookshelf, grateful for an excuse to focus on something other than Rebecca's campaign to convince me I was incapable of managing my own life. While the children flipped through pages of family photos, Rebecca continued her argument with lowered voice. "Mom, I know this is hard to accept, but Kevin and I have been researching options, and there are some wonderful communities in North Carolina that would be perfect for you. Close to Tom and Ashley, beautiful weather, lots of activities for people your age, people my age." Rebecca was 31 years old, but she spoke about my 58 years as if I were approaching decrepitude. Her research into communities near Tom and Ashley revealed another layer of coordination I hadn't previously understood. My entire family had been planning my future without consulting me, mapping out a scenario where I'd be conveniently relocated near my ex-husband and his second wife. "Why North Carolina specifically?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Rebecca hesitated before responding. "It's not specific to North Carolina. We just think you'd benefit from a warmer climate and a more relaxed lifestyle. Somewhere you could focus on enjoying retirement instead of worrying about home maintenance and work stress. But you've specifically researched communities near Tom and Ashley. That seems like more than casual interest in warmer climates." The question made Rebecca uncomfortable, confirming my suspicions about the extent of family coordination. "Look, Mom, we all want what's best for you. If that means living near Dad and Ashley, where you'd have some support and familiar faces, then yes, we think that's worth considering. Support from Tom and Ashley." The irony was staggering. The man who'd abandoned our marriage for a younger woman and the woman who'd facilitated that abandonment were now being positioned as my support system. My children were so eager to remove me from their lives that they were willing to entrust my well-being to people who'd already proven their unreliability. "Look at this picture, Grandma." Jack had found a photo from his 5th birthday party, held in my backyard with a Batman theme and homemade decorations. "I remember this. You made that amazing cake that looked like the Batcave." His excitement about the memory highlighted the irony of the conversation happening around him. Rebecca was arguing that I should abandon the home where I'd created those memories, the space where her children had experienced some of their happiest moments, the place they associated with love and celebration. That was a fun party, wasn't it? I smiled at Jack while addressing Rebecca indirectly. This house has seen a lot of happy memories over the years. Rebecca caught the subtext, but didn't acknowledge it directly. Of course it has, Mom. But memories aren't tied to buildings. They're about relationships and experiences that can happen anywhere. Her dismissal of the importance of place felt typical of her generation's casual relationship with permanence and tradition. Rebecca had moved 4 times since college, always chasing better opportunities or more convenient circumstances. She didn't understand the deep roots that come from decades of investment in a single place. Mommy, why can't Grandma just stay here? Emma's question was delivered with the straightforward logic of childhood. She likes her house, and we like visiting her here. Rebecca's face flushed slightly, caught between her adult agenda and her daughter's innocent wisdom. It's complicated, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make changes even when they don't want to. Why? Emma persisted. Is something wrong with Grandma's house? Nothing's wrong with it, Rebecca said quickly. We just think Grandma might be happier somewhere else. But she said she likes it here. Emma's confusion was understandable. Children hadn't yet learned to ignore stated preferences in favor of what others decided was best. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Rebecca presenting various arguments for why I should consider relocating while I deflected each suggestion without direct confrontation. The children's presence prevented the kind of honest discussion that might have cleared the air, but it also revealed the hollowness of Rebecca's arguments when examined through the lens of childish logic. After they left, I sat in my quiet house processing the evening's revelations. Rebecca's visit hadn't been spontaneous but calculated, timed to catch me in a relaxed mood after work when I might be more receptive to suggestions about major life changes. Her research into specific communities near Tom and Ashley proved this wasn't casual family concern, but coordinated planning for my future. Most troubling was the realization that my children saw my attachment to my home as unreasonable rather than natural. They were ready to dismiss decades of investment, both financial and emotional, in favor of arrangements that would be more convenient for them. My preferences were obstacles to be overcome rather than factors to be respected. Wednesday brought a phone call from Andrew that confirmed my growing suspicions about family coordination. Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation Friday, and I wanted to follow up on the real estate situation. What about it? I was at work, reviewing patient charts during a brief break between rounds. I did some research on comparable sales in your neighborhood, and the numbers are really impressive. You could probably get close to $400,000 for your place. Maybe more with the right marketing strategy? That would give you amazing flexibility for your next chapter. $400,000. Andrew had done considerable research to arrive at such a specific figure, suggesting this wasn't casual interest, but serious financial analysis. He was calculating my home's value the way he might evaluate an investment property, focusing on numbers rather than emotional significance. That's interesting information, but I'm not planning to sell. I know you're not planning to sell right now, but it's worth thinking about the opportunity cost. Andrew's voice took on the professional tone he used when discussing client portfolios. Property values might not stay this high forever, and you're carrying maintenance expenses that could be eliminated with a smaller place. Opportunity cost. My son was applying investment terminology to my living situation, reducing my home to a financial equation rather than recognizing it as the foundation of my stability and happiness. His analysis ignored intangible benefits like community connections, emotional attachment, and the simple pleasure of living in a space I'd shaped according to my own preferences. The conversation continued with Andrew presenting various scenarios for how I might optimize my financial position through relocation. He'd researched costs of living in different regions, analyzed potential investment returns, and calculated how much money I could save by moving to a less expensive area. His thoroughness was impressive, but also revealing. He'd invested considerable time in planning my future without consulting me about my actual goals or desires. After hanging up, I found myself wondering how long my children had been discussing. my finances and living situation. Their knowledge was too detailed and coordinated to represent recent casual conversations. They'd been analyzing my life like a business problem, developing strategies to optimize outcomes according to their definition of success rather than mine. Thursday evening brought the most revealing conversation yet. Sarah called while I was making dinner, ostensibly to check on how I was feeling after Rebecca's visit. But as we talked, it became clear she had additional agenda items to address. "Mom, I've been thinking about what Rebecca said about senior communities, and I did some research of my own. There's actually a really nice place about an hour from here that might be perfect for you." Sarah had been researching housing options for me, another family member investing time and energy in planning my future without my request or input. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. "What kind of place?" I asked, though I was beginning to dread the answer. "It's called Sunset Manor, and it's designed for active adults 55 and older. They have a golf course, fitness center, art studios, even continuing education classes. You'd love the art programs, and there are tons of social activities." Sunset Manor. Even the name sounded like a euphemism for waiting to die. Sarah was describing an age-segregated community where I'd be surrounded by people society had decided were finished with productive life and ready for supervised recreation. That sounds very organized. I kept my voice neutral while processing the implications of Sarah's research. "How did you learn about this place?" "I drove out there last weekend and took a tour." Sarah's admission revealed premeditation that went far beyond casual concern. She'd spent her weekend investigating housing alternatives for me, presumably with the intention of presenting them as attractive options I should consider. "You toured a senior community on my behalf without mentioning it to me first?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but Sarah's presumption was breathtaking. I wanted to make sure it was actually nice before bringing it up. Some of those places can be pretty depressing, but this one is really beautiful. The woman who gave me the tour said they have a waiting list because it's so popular. A waiting list. Sarah was describing Sunset Manor like an exclusive club rather than institutional housing for people who'd been categorized as too old for regular community life. Her enthusiasm for the facility revealed how completely she'd accepted the premise that I needed to be relocated somewhere more appropriate for my age and circumstances. The conversation continued with Sarah describing various amenities and programs available at Sunset Manor, painting a picture of organized activities and supervised socialization that made me feel claustrophobic. She'd clearly been coached by someone, possibly the tour guide, about how to present institutional living as an attractive lifestyle choice. Most disturbing was Sarah's casual assumption that I'd be interested in abandoning the life I'd built for myself in favor of programmed activities designed for people who'd supposedly outgrown independence. She spoke about art classes and book clubs as if they were adequate compensation for giving up my home, my community, and my autonomy. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen trying to process the full scope of what my children had been planning. Rebecca had researched communities near Tom and Ashley in North Carolina. Andrew had analyzed my financial situation and property values. Sarah had toured facilities in Connecticut and was prepared to advocate for specific options. This wasn't family concern, but a coordinated campaign to convince me to relocate according to their vision of what my life should look like. The realization that my children had been collaborating to manage my future without including me in the discussion felt like betrayal on a scale I hadn't experienced since discovering Tom's affair. They'd reduced me to a problem requiring solution, rather than recognizing me as an adult capable of making informed decisions about my own life. Friday morning brought gray skies and the kind of bone-deep cold that promised a harsh winter. I dressed for work with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd performed the same routine thousands of times. But my mind was elsewhere, processing the week's revelations and trying to decide how to respond to my children's coordinated campaign. At the hospital, I found myself observing family dynamics with new awareness. Mrs. Peterson's daughter had driven 3 hours to be with her mother during surgery recovery, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair and taking time off work without complaint. Mr. Garcia's son visited twice daily, bringing fresh clothes and helping with physical therapy exercises. These adult children demonstrated the kind of love and commitment I'd always assumed existed in healthy families. The contrast with my own situation was stark. My children were expending considerable energy planning my future, but their efforts focused on removing me from their lives rather than finding ways to maintain connection and support. They wanted to solve the problem of my continued existence, rather than embrace the opportunities that come with aging parents who remain healthy and independent. During lunch, I called Janet Sullivan and asked her to prepare a comprehensive market analysis for my property. Not because I was ready to sell, but because I wanted to understand the full scope of my options. Knowledge was power, and my children had been operating from positions of superior information while keeping me in the dark about my own circumstances. Janet promised to have the analysis ready by Monday, including comparable sales, market trends, and projected values for the coming year. She also mentioned several clients who were looking for properties in my neighborhood, successful professionals who appreciated the combination of suburban charm and convenient access to Hartford. That evening, I sat in my living room reviewing the week's conversations and trying to understand how my relationships with my children had evolved into their current state. When had I stopped being a person they valued and become a responsibility they wanted to manage? When had my preferences become obstacles to overcome rather than factors to consider? The answer, I realized, was gradual and probably inevitable, given the patterns we'd established over decades. I'd trained my children to see me as someone who provided services without expecting much in return. I'd been so focused on being a good mother that I'd forgotten to insist on being treated as a full person deserving respect and consideration. But recognition of the problem didn't automatically suggest solutions. My children were adults with established patterns of thinking about me and my role in their lives. Changing those patterns would require disrupting comfortable assumptions and forcing them to reconsider their approach to our relationships. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about Dorothy Chen's advice about being willing to disrupt patterns even when it created conflict. Maybe it was time to stop being the accommodating mother who accepted whatever treatment my children offered and start being a woman who insisted on respect and inclusion in decisions affecting her life. The question was how to communicate that transformation in ways they couldn't ignore or dismiss as temporary emotional reaction. Whatever I decided to do would need to be clear, permanent, and undeniable. Saturday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, both in the weather and in my resolve. I'd spent Friday night making a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. If my children wanted to treat me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected, then it was time they learned what losing my cooperation actually meant. I started with Sarah's laptop. She'd left it at my house Tuesday when she'd stopped by to pick up leftover soup, claiming she'd forgotten it in her rush to get to work. But Sarah never forgot her laptop. She was attached to that device like other people were attached to their phones. The laptop had been deliberately left behind, and I was beginning to understand why. The screen was still logged into her email account, displaying a conversation thread that made my blood run cold. The subject line read, "Mom Situation, Timeline Update," and the participants included all 3 of my children, Tom, Ashley, and someone named Dr. Martinez, whom I didn't recognize. The emails dated back 6 months. 6 months of my children discussing my mental state, my financial situation, and their plans for my future. Sarah had been documenting my behavior, noting times when I seemed forgetful or tired, occasions when I'd repeated stories or misplaced items. She'd been building a case for my incompetence, creating a paper trail that could be used to justify forcing changes in my living situation. Rebecca's contributions focused on financial concerns, complete with copies of documents she'd somehow obtained from my house during previous visits. Bank statements, insurance policies, even medical records from routine checkups. She'd been systematically gathering information about my private affairs without my knowledge or consent. Andrew's emails were the most clinical, analyzing my cognitive function and questioning whether I was capable of making sound financial decisions. He'd researched legal procedures for gaining power of attorney and had been corresponding with Dr. Martinez, apparently a geriatric psychiatrist, about assessments for early-stage dementia. The most devastating email was from Tom, sent just 2 days after Thanksgiving. Linda seemed confused during our conversation about downsizing. Ashley thinks we should accelerate the timeline for getting her into supervised care before she makes any major financial mistakes. The kids are worried she's becoming paranoid and defensive about perfectly reasonable suggestions. Paranoid and defensive. My legitimate concerns about their secretive behavior and coordinated pressure campaign had been reframed as symptoms of mental decline. My resistance to their plans had been pathologized, turned into evidence that I was incapable of rational decision-making. The final email in the thread was from Dr. Martinez, dated yesterday. Based on the documentation you've provided, I believe we have sufficient grounds for a competency evaluation. The combination of social isolation, resistance to reasonable lifestyle changes, and reported cognitive slippage suggests intervention may be warranted. I can schedule an assessment for next week if the family is prepared to proceed. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. My children, with Tom's support and Ashley's encouragement, had been working with a psychiatrist to build a case for taking away my legal rights. The pressure to move, the research into senior communities, the financial analysis of my property, it had all been preparation for forcing me into supervised care against my will. I sat in my kitchen holding Sarah's laptop, feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I could barely process the implications. My own children had been conspiring to have me declared incompetent, so they could control my assets and eliminate the inconvenience of considering my preferences. But as the initial shock wore off, it was replaced by something harder and more focused. Rage. Pure, clean fury at the people who'd taken my love and sacrifice and twisted it into justification for stealing my autonomy. They wanted to play games with my life? Fine. I could play games too. I forwarded the entire email thread to my personal account, then carefully cleaned the browser history on Sarah's laptop. When she came to retrieve it later, she'd find no evidence that I'd discovered their plan, but I would be ready for them. Monday morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. Instead of going to the hospital, I drove to the law offices of Peterson, Williams & Associates, where I'd made an appointment with Margaret Peterson, an attorney who specialized in elder law and family conflicts. Margaret was about my age, with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she'd seen every variation of family betrayal that existed. I presented her with printed copies of the email chain and explained the situation as objectively as I could manage. "This is unconscionable," Margaret said after reviewing the documents. "Your children have been gathering private information without your consent and collaborating with a medical professional to undermine your legal rights. We need to take immediate steps to protect you." Within 2 hours, Margaret had prepared several documents. A new will that removed my children as beneficiaries and established a charitable foundation in my name. Updated financial powers of attorney naming Margaret as my representative. Medical directives that specifically excluded my children from decision-making authority. And a cease and desist letter to Dr. Martinez threatening legal action if he proceeded with any assessment without my explicit consent. "Are you sure about these changes?" Margaret asked as I signed each document. "They're comprehensive and irreversible. Your children will have no legal claim to your assets or decision-making." Authority. I thought about Rebecca's secret move to Seattle, Andrew's financial calculations, Sarah's surveillance and documentation, Tom's casual dismissal of my feelings, and Ashley's suggestions about supervised care. I thought about 6 months of coordination and planning that had excluded me entirely from decisions about my own future. "I'm sure," I said, signing my name with steady hands. Tuesday evening, Sarah arrived to collect her laptop, bubbling with nervous energy and apologies for the inconvenience. She chattered about work stress and her latest art project while I served tea and pretended everything was normal. Her performance was masterful, combining genuine affection with subtle information gathering. "How are you feeling, Mom? You seemed a little overwhelmed when Rebecca visited last week." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just processing some big changes." Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. "What kind of changes?" "Oh, just thinking about the future. You know how it is when you reach a certain age. Time to start making some practical decisions." The bait worked perfectly. Sarah leaned forward, her expression brightening with what she probably thought was helpful enthusiasm. "That's so smart of you, Mom. Rebecca and Andrew will be so relieved that you're being proactive about planning." Relieved. As if my well-being was a burden they were eager to shed. Wednesday brought a call from Andrew, checking on my state of mind after our conversation about real estate values. His questions were carefully casual, designed to assess my cognitive function without appearing invasive. Was I sleeping well? Had I been forgetting things? Was I feeling overwhelmed by daily responsibilities? I answered each question with deliberate ambiguity, giving him just enough concern to feed his narrative while avoiding obvious contradictions. Yes, I'd been tired lately. Sometimes I did feel overwhelmed by managing the house alone. Perhaps it was time to consider some changes. Andrew's relief was audible. "Mom, I'm so glad you're being realistic about this. We all want what's best for you, and sometimes that means making difficult transitions before they become crisis situations." Thursday, Rebecca called to follow up on her visit and gauge my receptivity to relocation options. She'd found some additional communities in North Carolina that offered graduated care, starting with independent living and transitioning to assisted care as needed. The beauty of these places is that you can age in place without worrying about becoming a burden on family, Rebecca explained. "You'd have professional support available when you need it, and we could visit without feeling like we need to constantly check on your welfare." Burden. There was that word again. I was a burden they wanted to transfer to professionals so they could maintain the fiction of caring without the inconvenience of actual involvement. Friday afternoon, Margaret Peterson called to confirm that all legal documents had been filed and recorded. "Your children no longer have any claim to your assets or decision-making authority," she said. "If they attempt to proceed with competency proceedings, we're prepared to present evidence of their conspiracy and financial motivations." That evening, I prepared for the final act of this drama. I called each of my children and asked them to come to my house Saturday morning for an important family discussion. I told them I'd been thinking seriously about their suggestions and was ready to make some decisions about my future. The responses were telling. Rebecca immediately offered to research moving companies and transition services. Andrew volunteered to help with financial planning and asset management. Sarah suggested we invite Tom and Ashley to participate in the planning process. They were so eager to finalize their conspiracy that they couldn't conceive I might have discovered their betrayal. Saturday morning, they arrived within minutes of each other, clearly having coordinated their timing. Tom and Ashley came too, uninvited but obviously included in whatever strategy session they'd held. Dr. Martinez was notably absent, which suggested they weren't quite ready to spring their competency evaluation. I'd prepared coffee and pastries, playing the role of gracious hostess one final time. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was serving refreshments to people who'd been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could steal my life savings. "Thank you all for coming," I began, settling into my favorite chair while they arranged themselves around my living room like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. "I've been giving serious thought to your concerns about my living situation and future planning." The collective sigh of relief was almost audible. Rebecca actually smiled, probably imagining how quickly they could liquidate my assets once I was safely institutionalized. I appreciate how much time and energy you've invested in researching options for me, I continued, making eye contact with each of them. The communities you've found, the financial analysis you've prepared, the professional consultations you've arranged. It's been very thorough. Sarah shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing something in my tone that didn't match her expectations. Andrew frowned slightly, his analytical mind detecting inconsistencies in my presentation. In fact, I was so impressed by your dedication that I decided to do some research of my own. I pulled out a folder containing printed copies of their email correspondence. I wanted to understand exactly what you'd been planning for my future. The color drained from Rebecca's face as she recognized the documents. Andrew's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Sarah looked confused, not immediately grasping the implications of my discovery. "Mom," Rebecca started, "those emails are taken out of context. We were just concerned about your well-being and trying to explore options." 6 months of surveillance, I interrupted, my voice calm despite the fury burning in my chest. Gathering my private medical and financial information without permission. Consulting with a psychiatrist about having me declared incompetent. Planning to force me into supervised care so you could access my assets. Tom had the decency to look ashamed, but Ashley's expression remained defiant. "Linda, you're twisting this into something it isn't. We all want what's best for you." "What's best for me?" I repeated. "Let me tell you what would have been best for me. Being included in conversations about my future instead of being treated like a problem to solve. Having my preferences respected instead of dismissed as symptoms of mental decline. Being trusted to make my own decisions instead of having my children conspire to steal my legal rights." The silence that followed was deafening. My children stared at me with expressions ranging from guilt to anger to genuine surprise that I'd discovered their plan and was refusing to cooperate with my own victimization. "What happens now?" Andrew asked, his voice carefully controlled. I smiled, feeling genuinely happy for the first time in months. "Now you learn about consequences. I've revised my will, removing all of you as beneficiaries. I've changed my financial and medical powers of attorney to exclude family members. And I've instructed my attorney to pursue legal action against Dr. Martinez for participating in your conspiracy." "You can't do that," Rebecca protested. "We're your children. You can't just cut us out of your life over a misunderstanding." "I'm not cutting you out of my life," I corrected. "I'm cutting you out of my death. There's a difference. You're all welcome to maintain relationships with me based on love and respect instead of financial expectations. But your inheritance is going to charity, where it will actually help people instead of funding your comfortable lives." Sarah finally found her voice. "Mom, this is crazy. You're proving exactly what we were worried about. Nobody makes rational decisions like this." "Nobody rational tolerates being betrayed by their own children," I replied. "Nobody rational allows their family to steal their autonomy and dignity. I'm more rational now than I've been in years." Tom stood up, his expression mixing anger with something that might have been respect. "Linda, I think we should all take some time to cool down and discuss this more calmly." "There's nothing to discuss," I said firmly. "You've all shown me exactly what you think of me and what you're willing to do to get what you want. Now, you can live with the consequences of those choices." One by one, they filed out of my house, their faces reflecting various combinations of shock, anger, and defeat. Rebecca tried to argue that they could contest my legal changes. Andrew suggested family counseling to work through our communication problems. Sarah simply cried, perhaps finally understanding that actions have consequences even within families. After they left, I sat in my quiet living room feeling lighter than I had in decades. The people who'd raised me to believe that family was everything had taught me that family meant nothing when money was involved. But they'd also taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined. My phone rang constantly over the next few days. Voicemails ranged from tearful apologies to furious accusations to desperate bargaining attempts. I listened to each one once, then deleted them. Margaret Peterson fielded several calls from attorneys my children had hired, but the legal documents were ironclad. 2 weeks later, Rebecca, Andrew, and Sarah appeared at my door together, looking humbled in ways I'd never seen before. They asked if we could talk, really talk, about rebuilding our relationships on honest foundations. "We understand now," Rebecca said, her voice shaky with emotion. "We got so focused on solving problems that we forgot you weren't a problem to solve. You were our mother who deserved better than what we gave you." It wasn't enough to restore their inheritance, but it was a beginning. Over the following months, we slowly rebuilt relationships based on respect rather than exploitation. They learned to ask instead of assume, to include instead of exclude, to value my person instead of my resources. The charitable foundation I established provides college scholarships for children of single mothers, helping them avoid the financial struggles that had shaped so much of my adult life. My children volunteer for the foundation now, perhaps understanding finally that some legacies are more valuable than money. I never did move to a senior community or downsize to something more manageable. Instead, I retired early and traveled to places I'd always wanted to see. I took art classes and learned to garden more seriously. I dated a lovely widower I met at church, something my children worried about until they realized he had more money than I did. Most importantly, I learned that love without respect is manipulation, and family without boundaries is exploitation. My children had to lose their financial expectations to rediscover their genuine affection for me. It was a harsh lesson, but necessary for all of us. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals do come wrapped in family traditions, served on grandmother's china with smiles. But sometimes fighting back teaches everyone involved what love actually looks like when it's mixed with respect instead of entitlement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.